August 1945. The world was holding its breath, the fever of a global war finally breaking, leaving behind a continent of shivering, skeletal remains. For a particular group of German women prisoners of war, held in a nondescript camp on American soil, the world had not simply ended, it had collapsed into a uniform shade of gray. Their reality was the coarse weave of their smocks, the metallic taste of chlorinated water, the perpetual dampness that clung to the wooden barracks, and the suffocating blanket of silence that had replaced the roar of artillery and the scream of Stukas. They were the remnants of a shattered dream, the daughters of a fallen Valhalla, their minds still echoing with the grand Wagnerian pronouncements of a glorious destiny that now lay in ashes, indistinguishable from the rubble of Berlin, Dresden, and Hamburg. Their ideological armor, forged in the fires of the Bund Deutscher Mädel and tempered on the brutal Eastern Front, remained, though dented and scorched. They saw their American captors not as victors, but as temporary janitors of history. They were, according to the gospel of the Reich, a mongrel nation, a chaotic, decadent, and spiritually hollow society of capitalists and degenerates, their power a fragile illusion built on gold and trickery. Their soldiers, undisciplined boys, softened by jazz music and chewing gum. They expected cruelty, a vicious, vengeful punishment to match the apocalyptic fury they had witnessed in Europe. Or, perhaps worse, they expected incompetence, a lazy, disorganized sloppiness that would confirm their own inherent superiority even in defeat. The guards were polite but distant. The food was bland but plentiful. The routine was monotonous but orderly. This quiet, bureaucratic efficiency was unsettling, a subtle dissonance they couldn't quite place. It lacked the theatrical rage they had been conditioned to anticipate. They whispered among themselves in the thin, watery light of dawn, reaffirming the old certainties. This was a facade. This was a Potemkin village of a prison camp. The real America, the one they had been warned about, must be a morass of poverty, crime, and racial strife just beyond the barbed wire. They clung to this belief as a castaway clings to a piece of driftwood, for it was the only thing that kept the icy waters of their new reality from closing over their heads. The announcement came on a sweltering Tuesday, delivered by a young officer with an accent they identified as Midwestern and an earnestness they found faintly ridiculous. They were to be part of a re-education initiative. The words sounded clumsy, almost absurd in their clinical softness. They were to be taken on a field trip, an excursion. The destination was a place that, in their minds, was more myth than reality, a name synonymous with all the perceived corruption and decay of the New World. New York City. A collective sneer, unspoken but palpable, rippled through their ranks. The fools. The transparent, simple-minded Americans. Were they truly so naive as to believe a carefully curated tour of some sanitized avenue could undo a decade of ideological indoctrination? They envisioned being paraded down a single, freshly swept street, past a few well-stocked shops with actors posing as happy citizens, a pathetic theatrical performance designed to break their will. They steeled themselves for the display, ready to see through the flimsy propaganda, to find the cracks in the veneer, to mock the clumsiness of the effort. They would observe, they would dissect, and they would return to their barracks with their convictions not only intact, but strengthened by the enemy's foolishness. As they were herded onto the drab green military trucks, the mood was one of cynical amusement. They were soldiers of a fallen empire, yes, but they were not children to be swayed by cheap parlor tricks. They were about to witness the enemy's great lie, and they were prepared to bear witness to its hollowness with the cold, analytical gaze of the defeated, but ideologically unvanquished. The engine of the truck rumbled to life, a low growl that set them on a course not just across the New Jersey landscape, but into the very heart of a truth more devastating than any bomb. They felt the change first, not with their eyes, but through the soles of their worn-out shoes. The ferry deck vibrated with a deep, resonant hum, the powerful thrum of an engine that felt impossibly smooth, impossibly confident. The air, once tasting of pine and damp earth, now carried a new scent, salt, brine, and something else, something industrial and electric and alive. And then, through the haze of the August morning, it began to resolve itself. Not a city, that was too small a word. It was a geological formation, a serrated mountain range of steel and glass and stone that clawed at the sky, challenging the very heavens. It wasn't a silhouette, it was a statement. The women fell silent, the cynical chatter dying in their throats. The scale was a physical blow, an assault on the senses that their minds, conditioned by the horizontal ruins of Europe, simply could not process. The buildings were not just tall, they were arrogant. They soared with a verticality that seemed to defy not only gravity, but also the very concept of scarcity and limitation. This could not be real. Their first, collective, unspoken thought was that it was a trick of the light, a monstrously clever painted backdrop, a piece of Hollywood stagecraft erected for their benefit. It was the only explanation that allowed their worldview to remain stable. To accept it as real would be to accept a premise so fundamentally alien that it bordered on madness. But they knew, with a dawning, sickening certainty, that the concrete beneath their feet was a lie, and the impossible city before them was the truth. If you find this descent into a shattered worldview compelling, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. You won't want to miss where this journey into the heart of the American paradox leads. The landing was not a military operation. It was an act of casual, almost indifferent absorption. The ferry docked with a gentle bump, and they were led down a gangplank not into a cordoned-off guarded zone, but directly into the pulsating chaos of the city itself. The noise was the next wave of the assault, a cacophony so dense and multifaceted it was almost a liquid medium. It wasn't the sound of war, the singular screaming crescendo of a bomb, or the rhythmic hammering of machine gun fire. This was a symphony of a million mundane noises. The impatient honking of yellow taxicabs, the distant clang of a streetcar, the murmur of 1,000 conversations in a language they barely understood. The faint, tinny sound of jazz music spilling from a doorway, the squeal of brakes, the laughter of a child. It was the sound of life, uninterrupted and unapologetic, and it was more deafening than any explosion. They walked in a tight gray column, escorted by a handful of American soldiers who seemed more like tour guides than guards. The soldiers were relaxed, almost bored, their rifles held loosely, their attention often wandering to a newspaper stand or a pretty girl. The women had been trained for the focused, predatory gaze of an enemy. They were met with the fleeting, mildly curious glances of passers-by. They braced themselves for the hatred. They expected the stares, the vitriol, the spat curses of a populace whose sons had been sent to die on the beaches of Normandy and in the forests of the Ardennes. They were the enemy, the embodiment of the swastika, the living symbols of a regime that had plunged the world into darkness. They were prepared to endure the verbal and even physical assaults with stoic pride, a testament to their own resilience. But the hatred never came. The people of New York ignored them. A businessman in a crisp suit sidestepped their column with a flicker of annoyance, his mind clearly on a stock ticker or a lunch meeting. A pair of young women, their arms linked, laughed at some private joke, their eyes passing over the gray-clad prisoners without a flicker of recognition. A delivery boy on a bicycle swerved around them, whistling a popular tune. They were not objects of hate. They were not even objects of curiosity for more than a passing second. They were simply an obstruction, a drab, slow-moving inconvenience in the vibrant, high-speed current of the city. This casual indifference was a psychological blow far more profound and disorienting than any overt hostility could ever have been. Hatred would have affirmed their significance, acknowledging them as a worthy and dangerous foe. This complete and utter lack of interest stripped them of their identity. They were not soldiers of a great cause. They were merely ghosts haunting a feast, invisible to the celebrants. The streets themselves were a silent, damning testimony. The women's eyes, accustomed to scanning for threats and navigating through rubble, were now forced to take in a different kind of landscape. The windows were not shattered and boarded up. They were vast, polished sheets of plate glass gleaming in the sun. The pavement was not a cratered moonscape of broken stone and twisted rebar. It was a smooth, unbroken ribbon of black asphalt, marked with clean white lines. There were no skeletal, burned-out husks of buildings. Every structure was whole, solid, and occupied. They saw cleaners washing the windows of a skyscraper hundreds of feet in the air. They saw men in overalls repairing a stretch of sidewalk, their work methodical and unhurried. The city was not just intact, it was meticulously maintained. It was a living, breathing organism that was constantly preening and grooming itself, a creature of immense power and vanity. They remembered the desperate efforts back home, the women and children clearing rubble brick by brick, the constant struggle to patch a leaking roof or shore up a collapsing wall. Here, perfection seemed to be the baseline, the effortless norm. This wasn't a city that had won a war. This was a city that didn't even seem to know a war had happened. And they were beginning to understand that this effortless perfection was a weapon more powerful than any V-2 rocket. The contrast is staggering, a collision of two realities. What happens when a mind built on scarcity confronts a world of impossible abundance? Leave a comment below with your thoughts on the power of psychological warfare. They were marched past a movie theater, a grand palace of light and color. A massive marquee, studded with hundreds of glittering electric bulbs, announced a film starring actors whose smiling, impossibly handsome faces stared down at them from colossal posters. The colors were lurid, technicolor promises of romance and adventure. The women looked at the posters, then at their own gray smocks, at their hands with fingernails permanently rimmed with dirt, at their faces gaunt from years of rationing and stress. They remembered the newsreels in Germany, black and white, grainy, filled with images of marching soldiers, roaring tanks, and grim-faced leaders promising 1,000 years of glory. This American propaganda was different. It didn't promise glory or sacrifice or a place in history. It promised happiness. A simple, frivolous, and utterly seductive happiness that felt both insulting and deeply aching desirable. The people streaming in and out of the theater were not a grim, determined populace steeled for war. They were couples on dates, families on an outing, their faces relaxed, their laughter easy. They were buying popcorn and soda from a concession stand that seemed to overflow with treats. The smell of butter, sugar, and roasting nuts wafted out into the street, a fragrant assault on the women's senses, triggering memories of childhood Christmases before the world had turned to iron and ash. The true assault, however, began at the shop windows. It started with a corner grocery store. They were halted for a moment to let a stream of traffic pass, and their eyes were drawn to a pyramid of oranges. Not one or two, carefully hoarded and displayed like jewels, but a mountain of them, hundreds upon hundreds, each one a perfect, luminous sphere of impossible color. In Germany, an orange was a myth, a pre-war memory, a treasure reserved for the highest echelons of the party, or for a soldier dying in a field hospital. Here, they were piled up with a casual, almost vulgar profligacy. Beside them were bananas, apples, and grapes, a cornucopia of produce so fresh and flawless it looked unreal. Then came the butcher shop, its window hung with slabs of beef, pork, and whole chickens, their pale skins glistening under the lights. The women's stomachs, long accustomed to thin turnip soup and coarse black bread, clenched with a hunger that was more than physical. It was a hunger for a world where food was not a weapon, not a tool of control, not a constant gnawing source of anxiety, but simply food. They saw cans stacked to the ceiling, their colorful labels promising peaches, pineapple, and corn. They saw loaves of white bread, soft and pillowy, a stark contrast to the dense, sawdust-filled bricks that had been their sustenance. The procession continued, and each window was a fresh verse in an epic poem of overwhelming abundance. A department store window stopped them in their tracks. Mannequins with serene, indifferent plaster faces were dressed in the latest fashions. Dresses made of silk and rayon in vibrant floral prints and bold, confident stripes. Shoes with high heels crafted from lustrous, unblemished leather. Handbags, hats, and gloves, an entire universe of accessories designed not for utility, but for beauty and whim. One of the women, a former nurse who had spent 4 years dressing wounds with paper bandages, stared at a display of nylon stockings. They were sheer, delicate, and impossibly perfect, presented on elegant, disembodied legs. She remembered the frantic, nationwide drives to collect silk for parachutes, the thrill of receiving a single precious, often mended pair of stockings as a gift. Here, they were a commodity, displayed with the casual ease of potatoes in a bin. It was in this moment that the first, most dangerous thought began to take root in their collective consciousness. They had not been fighting a nation of soldiers. They had been fighting a nation of consumers, and the terrifying power that implied was only just beginning to dawn on them. The sheer, systemic nature of it all was what began to break them. This wasn't a single, curated street. It was every street. It wasn't one shop. It was every shop. This story is about more than just a tour. It's about the moment an entire ideology confronts a reality it cannot explain. If you appreciate these deep dives into the psychological side of history, make sure you're subscribed. The guards led them into a strange, noisy, and wonderfully fragrant establishment called a diner. The air was thick with the smell of frying onions and grilling meat, a scent so primal and enticing that it made them dizzy. They were seated in a booth upholstered in bright red vinyl that was cool and smooth to the touch. The table was made of formica, wiped clean to a shine, and set with heavy, solid silverware and a dispenser full of paper napkins. A waitress, a young woman with a formidable pile of blonde hair and a cheerful, slightly impatient demeanor, approached them. She did not look at them with fear or contempt. She looked at them with the brisk, professional gaze of someone who had a job to do. She took their orders from the American officer, hamburgers and Coca-Cola for everyone. The words meant nothing to them. They sat in stiff, wary silence, observing the other patrons. They were a cross-section of the city. Workers in dusty overalls, secretaries on their lunch break, a pair of sailors laughing loudly. They ate with a kind of focused, unthinking enjoyment. They were not savoring a rare treat. They were refueling a mundane and necessary part of their day. The food arrived on thick, heavy ceramic plates. The hamburger was a monument of bread and meat. A thick patty of ground beef, grilled until it was seared on the outside and juicy within, sat nestled in a soft, round, white bun, adorned with a slice of pickle and a smear of mustard. To women who had subsisted on watery stews and root vegetables, it was an object of almost obscene luxury. They picked it up hesitantly, their movements clumsy and uncertain. The first bite was a revelation. The richness of the meat, the soft texture of the bun, the sharp tang of the pickle and mustard. It was a cascade of flavors and textures that overwhelmed their starved palates. It tasted of plenty. It tasted of a world where cows were not requisitioned for the army, and wheat was not rationed down to the last grain. It was the taste of a system that worked, a system that could produce this simple, perfect meal for millions of people every single day without a second thought. They ate in a desperate, almost feral silence, a hunger of years being sated in a few short minutes. There was a shame in their hunger, a humiliation in the sheer animal pleasure they were taking in the enemy's food. Then came the Coca-Cola. It was served in a gracefully curved glass, filled with ice cubes that clinked musically against the sides. The liquid itself was a dark, mysterious brown, fizzing with a frantic energy. They had never seen anything like it. They drank. The first sip was a shock, an intense chemical sweetness, a strange spicy flavor they couldn't identify, and the prickly tingle of carbonation on their tongues. It was completely artificial, utterly modern, and strangely addictive. It was the flavor of a world they didn't belong to. It was not a natural taste, like water from a well or milk from a cow. It was an industrial product, a manufactured pleasure, a testament to a society that had mastered chemistry and marketing and mass production to create a beverage that had no purpose other than to be enjoyed. As they drained their glasses, they looked at one another over the rims, and in their eyes was a shared, unspoken understanding. The bombs that had leveled their cities were a crude and obvious form of power. This hamburger, this glass of Coca-Cola, this was something else entirely. It was a quieter, more insidious form of power, the power of production, of logistics, of a seemingly infinite capacity to generate not just weapons, but simple, everyday pleasures. Their entire 4-year ordeal on the Eastern Front, with its frostbite, its starvation, and its relentless grinding attrition, seemed to shrivel in the face of this simple, greasy, and undeniably magnificent American meal. We often think of wars as being won with tanks and planes, but what if the most powerful weapon is a well-stocked grocery store? Share this video with someone who loves to rethink history. The human element remained the most baffling and corrosive part of the experience. After the meal, as they were led back onto the streets, a small event occurred that would crystallize their confusion. A young boy, no older than 5 or 6, chasing a red ball, stumbled and fell directly into the path of their column. He landed at the feet of the woman named Ilse, who had been a Luftwaffe radio operator and had seen the mangled bodies of children pulled from the rubble of Hamburg. Her first instinct, a deeply ingrained reflex, was to recoil, to see the boy as a potential threat, a distraction, a part of the hostile landscape. The boy's mother, a look of panic on her face, rushed forward. For a split second, there was a palpable tension. The German woman and the American mother stared at each other over the crying child. The mother's eyes were not filled with hate for the woman in the enemy uniform. They were filled only with the universal, primal fear of a parent for her child. The American guard closest to the incident took a step forward, but the German woman was faster. Acting on an instinct she thought had long been buried, she knelt down, her knees cracking, and gently helped the boy to his feet. She brushed the dust from his trousers with a practiced, maternal motion. The boy, startled more than hurt, stopped crying and stared up at her with wide, curious blue eyes. He saw not a monster, not a Nazi, but simply a woman with a kind touch. The mother reached them, scooping her child into her arms. She looked at the German prisoner, and for a moment the uniforms, the politics, the war, all of it melted away. She offered a small, hesitant smile and a quiet, "Thank you." Then she turned and disappeared back into the crowd, scolding her son gently for running into the street. The German woman, Ilse, remained kneeling on the pavement for a long moment, staring at the spot where the mother and child had been. The simple, human decency of the exchange, the complete absence of politically charged animosity, had shaken her more than any interrogation or threat. It suggested that these people operated on a different set of principles. Their humanity was not contingent on nationality or uniform. It was their default setting. This small, almost trivial encounter resonated through the group. They discussed it later in hushed tones. They had been taught that the enemy was subhuman, a degenerate race that needed to be cleansed or conquered. They had been shown films of American soldiers as brutal, leering gangsters, but the reality they were encountering was one of mundane civility. The people they saw were not paragons of virtue, but they were fundamentally decent in 1,000 small, unremarkable ways. They held doors for each other. They said, "Excuse me," when they bumped into someone. They queued in orderly lines. This pervasive, low-level politeness was a constant, unnerving refutation of the propaganda that had been the bedrock of their existence. The ideology of the Reich was built on a foundation of grand, dramatic emotions: heroic sacrifice, righteous fury, glorious death, and seething hatred for the designated enemy. It had no vocabulary for the quiet, unassuming strength of a society held together by a shared sense of basic courtesy and mutual respect. It was a strength they couldn't fight because they couldn't even comprehend it.
The foundations of their belief system, which had withstood bombs and bullets and the loss of everything they held dear, were being eroded by 1,000 tiny waves of ordinary, everyday kindness. The psychological impact of this tour is profound. It's a masterclass in deprogramming. What do you think was the single most powerful element of this shock and awe of normalcy? Let us know in the comments. The culmination of the tour, the final unanswerable argument, was the ascent. They were taken to the Empire State Building, a name they knew only as a symbol of arrogant American capitalism. They were herded into a small enclosed room, an elevator, and with a smooth, almost imperceptible surge of power, the ground fell away. They rose and rose and rose, a silent, vertical journey that left their stomachs behind and filled their ears with a gentle pressure. When the doors slid open, they stepped out onto the observation deck, and the city, which had already overwhelmed them at street level, delivered its coup de grace. They were standing on the 86th floor, 1,000 feet above the pavement, and all of New York City was laid out beneath them like a vast, living map. The sheer, terrifying, magnificent scale of it finally hit them with the force of a physical impact. The yellow cabs they had seen up close were now tiny, crawling insects. The people were microscopic specks, an undifferentiated river of humanity flowing through the canyons of the city. From this godlike vantage point, they could see the system. It wasn't just a collection of tall buildings. It was a complex, interconnected, perfectly functioning machine. They saw the bridges, delicate-looking but powerful steel webs stitching the boroughs together, with endless streams of cars flowing across them. They saw the docks, where massive freighters, flying the flags of a dozen nations, were being loaded and unloaded by an army of cranes. They saw the vast green rectangle of Central Park, a deliberate, man-made oasis of nature in the heart of the concrete jungle. They saw the endless, repeating grid of the streets stretching out to the horizon, a testament to logic, order, and planning on a scale that dwarfed anything they had ever imagined. And everywhere they looked, they saw wholeness. There were no ruins, there were no bomb craters, there were no vast, empty spaces where neighborhoods used to be. The organism was whole and unscarred. All the destructive fury of the war they had participated in, a war that had consumed their nation and their souls, had not managed to land a single meaningful blow on this place. It was at that moment, standing in the high, thin air above Manhattan, that the last remnants of their ideological armor shattered and fell away. The lies they had been told were not just incorrect, they were pathetic. They were the infantile fantasies of a regime that had mistaken its own hysterical fanaticism for genuine strength. They had been told they were a master race, destined to rule the world. But the people who had built this city, this civilization, had done so not with slogans and goose steps, but with concrete, steel, capital, and a relentless, pragmatic ingenuity. They had waged a war on two fronts, across two oceans, and had defeated two of the most formidable military machines in history. And they had done it all while barely breaking a sweat, without sacrificing their abundance, their comfort, or their fundamental way of life. The women looked out at the endless vista of power and wealth and confidence, and for the first time they felt the true soul-crushing weight of their defeat. It was not a military defeat decided by battles and tactics. It was a civilizational defeat, a complete and utter invalidation of everything they had been taught to believe. The war had been lost long before the first shot was fired, here in the offices and factories and diners of a nation they had fatally, catastrophically misunderstood. The story of these women is a powerful reminder that wars are fought not just on battlefields, but in the minds of people. If you agree, please like this video and share it. It helps us continue to tell these important, overlooked stories. The ride back to the camp was conducted in a profound and heavy silence. The sights on the return journey, the same bridges, the same highways, were no longer objects of curiosity. They were now monuments to their own failure. The women did not look at each other. They stared out the windows of the truck, but they were no longer seeing the American landscape. They were seeing the ghosts of their former selves, the confident young women who had believed in the Führer, in the party, in the inevitable triumph of the will. They were seeing the faces of their brothers, fathers, and sweethearts who had died for a lie so vast and all-encompassing that it had blotted out the sun. The shame was a physical presence in the truck, a choking dust that was thicker than the exhaust fumes. It was not the shame of being a prisoner, but the shame of having been a fool. The humiliation of having sacrificed so much, family, morality, humanity itself, for a cause that was not just wrong, but absurdly, demonstrably, laughably outmatched. Upon their return to the camp, the familiar grayness seemed different. Before, it had been a symbol of their oppression, the bleak reality imposed upon them by their captors. Now, it felt like home in the worst possible way. The drab barracks, the meager rations, the culture of scarcity and suspicion. This was a perfect reflection of the world they had fought to create, the world their ideology had actually produced. America was not the facade. Their Germany, their fortress Europe had been the facade. It was a grand, Gothic stage set built of propaganda and terror, and behind it was nothing but rubble and starvation. The re-education program, which they had initially mocked as a clumsy attempt at brainwashing, was now revealed for what it was, a masterstroke of psychological warfare. The Americans hadn't needed to show them films or give them lectures. They hadn't needed to torture them or browbeat them into submission. All they had to do was hold up a mirror to show them a single ordinary day in their own world and let the devastating contrast do the work. In the weeks and months that followed, a quiet but profound transformation took place within the group. The old certainties were gone, replaced by a vast, terrifying emptiness. The bonds of their shared ideology, once as strong as steel, had dissolved. They were no longer a unit, a cohort of true believers. They were just a collection of broken, disillusioned individuals, each adrift in her own private sea of doubt and regret. They began to ask for books, to read about American history and government, not out of any newfound patriotism, but with the desperate curiosity of an anthropologist studying a bafflingly successful alien species. How did it work? What was the source of its power? They were trying to understand the nature of the force that had so effortlessly crushed them. The tour of New York City had not been a day trip, it was a life sentence. It had condemned them to live forever with the knowledge of what they had seen, a memory of color and light and abundance that would make the gray realities of their past and future almost unbearable. They had been sent to the front lines to fight the enemy. But the most decisive battle they ever fought was lost on a Tuesday afternoon in a Manhattan diner, with a half-eaten hamburger growing cold in their hands. This journey from unshakable belief to total disillusionment is a testament to the power of reality. We create documentaries like this to explore the hidden corners of history. Support our work by joining our Patreon, where you'll get access to exclusive content and behind-the-scenes material. The long-term legacy of this experience for the women who endured it was a quiet and deeply personal schism in their own history. There was the time before New York and the time after. When they were eventually repatriated to a divided and ruined Germany, they carried the memory of that day like a secret sacrament. They could not speak of it. To whom could they describe the mountain of oranges? Who would understand the soul-crushing indifference of the crowds, or the theological implications of a glass of Coca-Cola? To a people struggling to find their next meal amidst the ruins, such stories would sound like madness, like the fever dreams of a traitor. Their experience had isolated them, setting them apart from their own people, who had only known the American as a conqueror, as the pilot of the bomber that had destroyed their homes. They knew something deeper and more unsettling. The American was most powerful not when he was dropping bombs, but when he was buying a new hat. This knowledge shaped the rest of their lives. Some embraced the new, democratic West Germany with the fervor of converts, seeing in the Marshall Plan and the nascent consumer culture a reflection of the power they had witnessed firsthand. They became proponents of a new way of life, their past convictions shed like a snake's skin. Others retreated into a bitter, silent cynicism, unable to embrace the new world, but forever alienated from the old. They saw the ideological battle as having been lost and simply withdrew from the field. For a few, the memory was a source of a strange, almost religious awe. They had seen something miraculous, a display of power so total that it defied human explanation. They had stood on the mountain and seen the kingdom, and it had broken them, but it had also, in a strange way, enlightened them. They had been forced to confront the truth, and while the truth had not set them free, it had irrevocably and permanently altered the lens through which they saw the world. The tour of New York City was never an official, widely publicized program. It was a small, experimental offshoot of the broader denazification efforts, its results likely filed away in some forgotten government archive. But for the small group of women who were its subjects, it was the single most significant event of the war. They had been captured by soldiers, but they had been conquered by a city. Their defeat was not marked by a treaty signed in a railway car, but by the quiet, internal surrender that took place on a skyscraper observation deck. They were living proof that the most effective propaganda is not a lie, but a truth so overwhelming that it shatters the recipient's entire frame of reference. They were the casualties of a war that had been won not with firepower, but with the mundane, miraculous, and utterly devastating spectacle of a normal day in an abnormal country. Their story is a quiet footnote in the grand, violent epic of the Second World War, a reminder that the deepest wounds are not always inflicted by shrapnel, and that the most profound battles are often fought and lost in the silent, secret territory of the human heart. They had gone to America as prisoners of war, but they returned to Germany as prisoners of a memory of a city of light that would forever cast a long, dark shadow over the ruins of their own shattered world. Thank you for joining us on this historical journey.
The past is filled with stories that challenge our understanding of the world. To ensure you don't miss our next exploration, click the subscribe button and ring the bell. Until next time, stay curious.